Jack, I want to do something I forgot to do, which is show everybody your book. Here it is. It's terrific. And I want to go to something that you didn't really address about you. You say that World War I was the birth of propaganda, American propaganda. And I wonder if you can tell us how different the newspaper business was, or the news business, say during the Civil War, because I know that Lincoln, I thought, was pretty good at commanding public opinion. And obviously you think that what happened in the Wilson era was completely different.
Well, so, every time propaganda is an old idea. Every time a king puts on an ermine robe and a bejeweled crown, they're doing propaganda. They're doing something to enlarge their office and give it authority. And you're right, Lincoln did have ways of gaining a foothold in public opinion. There's no question about that. And he did suspend habeas corpus, for example. And Stanton, who was one of his cabinet members, was very effective at actually using the press and controlling how the wires were used. So propaganda has two parts, right? One is the provision of information, and one is the suppression of information. You want to figure out, you want to change what people think, you have to suppress some information, and you have to give them lots of the information you want them to have. And Lincoln did some of that. Teddy Roosevelt was very effective getting publicity. He was the first to really have, press releases. But when it comes to a systematic, pervasive propaganda, thought out, run by a large agency, the size, the scale, and the scope of their work dwarfs anything that ever came before it.
I must say that I'm glad you mentioned the 4 Minutemen, because I was just astonished as I read about the 4 Minutemen and this squadron of people dispersed all over the United States. But there were so many levels here, some of which you've already talked about. But for instance, tell us about just the cartoon division.
Right. So that Creel was very inventive and very, very energetic, and he was also a terrible manager. He was just utter chaos. I mean, staff members would have to beg to see him to get answers. He'd find a good idea one day and be off someplace else. When they did a post-mortem on the CPI, they actually couldn't figure out exactly how many divisions had been and what names were changed because the files were so messed up. But there was a group of people who were doing cartoons apart from the CPI, but they wanted a place to go where they could do it more systematically. So they came to the CPI, and the CPI took them in. There was a bureau of cartoons, reported directly to Creel, and they would some of the leading cartoonists in the country would put together cartoons, and then that related to war themes, and then the CPI would syndicate them, send them out all over the United States, and they could be used for free by newspapers. So it was just one of their arms. It was one of the easier ones to run. It was fairly simple. You had pre-publication prints of newspaper cartoons, and you just mail them out.
Now, I know over the years, various administrations in different countries have argued that it's the duty of the news business to unify a country, and therefore propaganda is completely justified to try to steer a nation into war, for instance. How does that idea fit with what you found?
Well, that's a huge problem, right? Because you don't want to have a newspaper that seems to be utterly unpatriotic. I mean, not only would you lose subscribers, but you would just not feel good about yourself as an American. But there are questions of degree. That's what I would say. For one thing, just publishing CPI press releases, which many papers did, instead of looking into them yourself, would be a good idea. And I think there are places where you can ask serious questions. And there were some that were asked. Airplane production, for example, had problems, and the press would glom on the road. But because the president has such an overwhelming advantage in time of war, because it's a presumed national emergency, then you need to, it's easy for the president to bring the press along. But I'll give you one example of what I think would be is a very good example of what the press allowed itself to do and become complicit in. The war was an ocean away. There was no direct threat to us whatsoever. You know, there's a lot of debate about why we got in the war. And in fact, after the war was over, there were many people who thought that it was propagandists who got us in the war, British propagandists, which, by the way, is a part of my book that points out the extent to which the British used propaganda ahead of the war and how closely we worked with the British. So one way to make the war seem immediate was to suggest that there were spies everywhere who were trying to subvert the country. And in fact, Allan, if you don't mind, hold up the copy of the book again. The picture on the front is a picture by a guy named Joseph Pinnell, who was British but came to the United States, and he painted that picture. It's from a Liberty Loan poster, and it's a picture of the Statue of Liberty being bombed by German airplanes, and the whole of New York City being in flames, which was utterly preposterous concept. It wasn't going to happen, and the press. The CPI not only had posters like that, but they also put out a whole. In fact, they even had a syndicated column called "Spies and Lies," and the argument was that spies were everywhere. And anytime you heard anything that seemed to be at odds with the administration's point of view, that was planted by spies, or you were engaged in spy talk. You know, today we talk about things like fake news, right? You want to fence back information that you don't like, you call it fake news. Well, in those days, they called it spy talk. There were a lot of stupid rumors that went around, and it was a good idea to refute those. But a lot of the things that were said as being spy talk were really quite interesting and important ideas, like maybe we should negotiate peace right away instead of fighting to the bitter end. And so we created this kind of hysteria about the Germans that wasn't deserved. And actually had very adverse consequences when the war was over, because now you wanted to go and get a just peace, but you vilified the Germans, made them into beasts like Huns. You suggested they were riddling the country and subverting the country. And by the way, German Americans were very abused during the war. And so as a result of that, when you go to the peace table, it's hard to have a public opinion behind you on a just peace when you've been telling them all along that these people didn't deserve a just peace. It's worth pointing out that there was one spy who was caught during the entire war in the United States. One dummy who came across the border from Mexico to the United States with a terribly fabricated passport. And his idea was he was going to start an industrial revolution. He was going to start a revolution of a labor revolution in the United States. He got caught. He was found guilty. Only one. And I would add another point. The first law that was used to suppress speech in this country during the war was called the Espionage Act, named for spies. But there weren't a lot of spies in the United States once the war started. But that was used as an excuse for suppressing information.
Let me follow up with a question from chat.
I'm sorry, Allan. I want to finish that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's fine. So the point is, the press, instead of echoing this all the time and saying there were spies everywhere, they could have asked some questions. But they just took what the Justice Department told them and the Committee on Public Information told them and the State Department told them and just regurgitated it without any skepticism whatsoever.
That hasn't changed all that much.
That's one of my points.